All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. Thanks, everyone who's here online with us and those of you who are here in the room with us. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Kendra Lillienquist, who is an assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of Washington School of Medicine and PI at the Seattle Children's Research Institute Center for Child Health, Behavior, and Development. Dr. Lillienquist's research focuses on developing culturally responsive ways to address economic and racial disparities in child development outcomes. She collaborates with families and clinicians to design and test clinic and community-based interventions that best meet the needs of children in low-resource communities. She currently teaches population health in the community-oriented public health practice MPH program within the University of Washington School of Public Health. She serves as an academic and research mentor to undergraduate and graduate students. We're so excited to have you here. Welcome, Dr. Lillienquist.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm really excited to be here and share some of the work that I've been doing over the past several years. So I just want to start with an outline that we will be essentially talking about the background and the goals of the work that I'm doing. And then I actually want to take some time to talk about positionality, because that is a real core sort of foundation to the work that I do. And then I want to share a little bit about item response theory and why it is something that will be able to help us improve our approaches to developmental screening, and then what it will look like to actually have a new tool in practice. As you all know, I'm sure, developmental screening is a really key pediatric preventive care service. And this really allows us to identify children that are either experiencing delays or potential long-term disabilities that may be presenting in early childhood. And what I think is really key is that the factors that children live in terms of their environment, their socioeconomic surroundings, really do contribute to developmental delay, particularly when we're thinking about social-emotional development. Additionally, unfortunately, Black and Latinx children are less likely to receive appropriate screenings for numerous reasons within our healthcare system. Additionally, after age 2.5, well child care visits, as you all know, become annual. And this is somewhat limiting to being able to identify a lot of those social emotional support needs that tend to actually present more in like the 2 to 5 year old range. So there are a lot of factors right now contributing to a lack of time, resources, ability to carry out screenings in a way that is effective for families. And so the first being that we have a lack of provider time. In an additional study that I have done with Dr. Coker, we actually found that on average, well child visits were around 15 minutes, 14 to 15 minutes. But for Spanish-speaking families, they were 12 minutes, and for English-speaking families, they were 16 minutes. So if you can imagine all of the guidelines that are in Bright Futures that we're supposed to be able to get through in each visit, how is that even realistic? And then this reality of when you have families that don't speak English, and while you would think those visits would be longer, we actually audio recorded, and what we found was that translation, or I should say interpretation, isn't always available in a lot of these community clinics. And so what is happening is we have residents, we have providers who have some Spanish, but aren't necessarily, able to carry on full conversations. And so sometimes it sounds more like going through a checklist. And this honestly was happening in our English visits as well. Additionally, we have a really severe problem in this country in lots of major cities, and then in small cities for different reasons, where it's really difficult to access these resources. Our wait times can be years long, particularly when we're looking at diagnosing things like autism. And my colleagues in Boston are experiencing the same sort of long wait time. And then in rural places, we know that there's just not the availability of providers to be able to do these assessments. And then finally, the tools that we are using haven't necessarily been developed contextually or to be culturally responsive to the ways that different families understand their worlds. And I think a great example is this parent I saw online talking about how her 5-year-old got docked on a question when starting kindergarten that asked, where do you go to buy groceries? And the options were store and shop. And her daughter chose shop, which was the wrong answer. chose store, I think, and they wanted her to choose shop. And she said, Mama, we go to the shop to get our hair done. We go to the store to get groceries. And so these are just those little cultural differences that this child clearly knows what she's talking about, but the way that the assessment was created didn't account for that. And these sorts of things show up in our assessments all over. And then additionally, there is just a lack of structures in our care systems to be able to carry out these screenings and be able to follow up with families. So thinking about all of this, I really started to kind of be like, how can we address this? And so my training is actually in rehabilitation sciences. And so I spent a lot of time working with occupational and physical therapists that were designing these incredible interventions that were at the end of the referral line. And I was seeing who was actually being able to access these interventions, and it wasn't kids that looked like me. And so I really started to think, is there a way that we can take what's being done in rehab spaces and bring that into primary care to afford more equitable care to families that are not being able to access this end of the referral line? And then additionally, is there a way that, as I'm learning about all of these different measurement techniques, that we can actually use a measurement tool to inform an intervention? And so through lots of years of thinking and putting this all together, that's sort of where I've ended up. And so we have these sort of goals of wanting, culturally responsive screening, something that really can incorporate that parent-child interaction dynamic, particularly around the social-emotional development, something that could increase the frequency of screening, can inform those interventions, and then could be accessible across many platforms. So with that, I want to actually take a moment to pause and talk about positionality. So like I said, there are a lot of equity issues in our healthcare system that are really affecting a lot of children. And one way to really understand this is to approach it from a positionality framework. And so positionality are essentially these aspects of identity that are things like gender, class, race, religion. And what's important is these are positional markers of us in relation to other people in our society. So this is not necessarily how we see ourselves individually, but how we are socialized to see others in relation to us. And this happens really early, and it happens throughout our entire life. And then intersectionality is the way that we see these different positional markers interact to create either extreme privilege or a phenomenon of compounded disparities. And so this quote, I think, really presents what I'm talking about in terms of those compounded disparities more than I could just sort of explaining it. But I did my MPH here in global health at UW, and part of my cohort is having a group of students from Kenya. And these students are already doctors. This student wanted to, or hopes to run the World Health Organization one day. So she had been here for about 4 months, and I asked her, what has been your experience living in America? And she said, Black women are already low on the hierarchy in America, but Black women who are immigrants, society doesn't acknowledge us at all. And so 4 months into living here, she was already being socialized into her position in society. And this specifically came from riding the 45 bus that goes along UW's main campus, and her watching how people didn't move for her, didn't move for people who looked like her, who had accents, but people who looked other ways. Oh, you can have my seat. Let me help you with the groceries. Oh, you have a stroller. Let me help you. And so she was witnessing this happen in real time, and she was being sort of taught about her own worth. And as an adult, we have the ability to understand that. But as kids, we're socialized into this, and we don't have the ability to really understand it. We're actually asked to participate in a system that we don't even have the ability to consent to participating in. So, I am going to tell a brief story about why this matters to me so much, and then I'm going to actually ask you all to just spend a couple of minutes reflecting on your own positionality, mostly because I just think this is a really important thing for everybody to reflect on and leave with, and hopefully you can take it and sort of position it over the developmental screening work I'm doing, but even just in your own work. So I'm from Seattle. King County, Maple Valley, Seattle initially, then down south when, families couldn't afford to live here, which is still happening, and families are having to move down south, and that's why we built a second, Odessa Brown Clinic and all of that. But I want to actually rewind all the way back to 1958. So I am biracial, my mom is white, and she was raised in Tacoma. And at 6 years old, she was in a dance class with all other white girls, and a black family moved into the neighborhood. And most of you probably know that in Washington, hard racism wasn't on the books like it was in a lot of the rest of the country. And so it was much more a social practice. And so this family came to the dance teacher and asked, can our daughter participate? And the dance teacher said, I'm going to put it to a vote to the rest of the families. Except rather than have the parents vote, the parents told their daughters how to vote at the next dance class. And they all voted no. And so I want you all to take a moment to think about what it would be like to be 6 years old and being taught racism right there. And you're being asked to participate in it in a way that at 6 you don't really understand it. And so my mom told me that this really affected her, and she went to my grandma, my white grandma, and asked her, why did we do this? And my grandma basically said, well, that's how you voted. So this is how we see racism passed on generationally in this country without ever really accepting that we're the people that are doing it, right? So my grandma told my mom to do that and then absolved herself from being the one to tell her to do that. And so this is what happens to a lot of children in our country on that angle of learning racism, right? And this is why I think as adults, white people especially really struggle to talk about it because they were asked to participate in a system that they didn't understand when they were little and have really deep feelings around it that are really hard to bring up in adulthood. And so I encourage you all to just reflect on what messaging you maybe got in childhood. On the flip side, in 1958, my dad is being raised in the Carolinas, and he is incredibly dark-skinned. He is 6 years old at the same time. He's being told from his community that he is worthless, that he doesn't matter, and he's also getting that same messaging from his own family because of colorism. So he is being socialized into this system, again, not really being able to say, I want to be a part of this or not, and having to create his own sense of identity at 6 years old in that way. So we fast forward to 1988, and my parents meet. And because of their own childhood experiences, they want to have a child, but they're not together. And instead, my mother has decided to try and absolve herself of some of the racism she has participated in, that she's going to have a black child, biracial child. And my dad, because of the racism he's experienced growing up, is only going to have children with white women so that they can be lighter skinned. So positionality is important to me because I exist because of the messaging that my parents got growing up. And this is the reality of what the families that we are working with are hearing every day and having to make sense of and are carrying, the parents that we're supporting and the children that they're raising. And so with that story, I want to encourage you all to take just a few minutes to reflect on your own positionality and think about, are there any other identity aspects that are important? And then how do these positions relate to privileged and marginalized identity positions? So we'll come back at like 8:22. And I know we don't usually take a pause in the middle, but I think it's just important to kind of absorb this and reflect for a second. But I actually want to take a moment to ask people to just share briefly. We're not going to do like a whole 15-minute question and answer, but is there some thoughts that have come up that people would like to share right now? And if not, that's okay. I know maybe a lot of you weren't expecting it. Yeah. All right, we'll continue to reflect on this and think about it as we move through the rest of the presentation, and if thoughts come up at the end, we can continue to talk about that. So I just want to end with this section by saying that positionality matters because it's the way that we can either uphold or dismantle oppressive culture. And this tweet, before it was X, I thought did a really good example of addressing this. And so in our society, we still are very keen to say we're going to have the first X. We're talking about it right now with having our first Black female president. And while it's so important that we celebrate that, if we don't have the second part of that message, it will still always be seen as something for the marginalized groups to triumph over rather than the majority group to address. And what that is that having the first Black, having the first Asian, having the first woman, having the first whatever only happens when you have a system that has prevented that. And until we start including that there's a reason that we haven't had our first Black female president, it will seem like it's still just a one-off feat, that somebody special made it. And so this is where I really want to encourage us all to understand our own positionality and then use that as a way to essentially recognize when we're seeing different aspects of oppression being, exerted, and can we reframe that to think about it differently and intervene differently. Thank you all for taking the time to kind of go on that journey with me. I think that this is just really important for us as healthcare providers, as researchers, and as humans. Okay, back to the work that I've been doing. So this is a paper that Dr. Tumani Coker and I published in 2021 that really sought to sort of outline why we need a new structure of care delivery. And I think what's really, really key is to remember that our initial guidelines published in the late 60s that have been revised, but still function from that initial guideline, were published at the same time that people didn't have access to healthcare, or people could be denied, or at the first, sort of laws of civil rights of not denying people access to care were just coming into play. And before that, we had decades of the ability for hospitals to turn people away because of how they looked in different parts of the country. And I think what's really important is that in addition to that, things like housing discrimination and work discrimination, all of these things were explicitly legal, and we know that all of these things affect a child's development because of the environment they're being raised in. And so it's kind of silly to think that working under the same structure of care that was created when all of these different oppressive factors were legal would be appropriate in 2024 to address the way that these factors have impacted generations of kids now. And so essentially we adapted this on to the Donna Bedian and Starfield model from the 60s and 70s to essentially recognize that team-based care is sort of a way that we can create a new structure of care that still fits in a lot of our time limits and things like that, but that affords families an opportunity to receive a more holistic approach to the care that they need, particularly around, social screening and family support and things like that. And there's a lot of debate right now. Is that what primary care is supposed to be about? And I think we can keep having that debate. I say yes, because this is the only system that families before their children enter school are almost always guaranteed to interact with. So currently, my partners are primary care clinics in the Seattle area, and then Child Haven, which is a community organization. And wonderful work by Dr. Abby Grant and just amazing community health workers that have essentially created this developmental navigator program where they conduct screenings before the visits, are able to talk with the families, provide information to the provider, and then get those families connected to resources. And essentially what they've been able to do is sort of extend the length of a well visit, extend the capacity. And this is what we really have to start thinking about when we're talking about redesigning well child care, is really creating a larger capacity through a redesign of our teams and then who we consider a part of care in the community. So in doing that, what this is looking to address is several of these components of this framework. So team-based care, working with those community organizations, that health neighborhood, really drawing on all of the resources that are already available, and then really looking at improving, the parent-child health relationship, sort of all of these things that we would like to see. So with that, I now want to talk about why creating a new tool with item response theory combined with using community health workers can essentially create an entire new way of supporting families. And so I'm going to go into a little bit of detail around why item response theory is sort of our next wave of measurement work. So when we think about measuring anything, we recognize that there is a certain trait that we're looking at, and it falls on a continuum. And we measure if people have more of this trait or less of this trait. And we would think about this from things like motor development, social emotional skills, all the way up to, physical skills or, running and things like that. In using item response theory, we're actually able to better understand the way that the specific items that we're using work and function. And so in addition to looking for unidimensionality, which is something that we do often do through factor analysis in classical test theory, we're also able to look at something called local independence and differential item function. And so local independence essentially is able to show us if people are understanding the same question or different questions in the same way. And I know you all have probably filled out questionnaires where you're like, didn't this question just ask this? Isn't this the same? And so we're actually able to be like, yeah, this is measuring the exact same thing, and we actually don't need to be asking this question at all. And so what that looks like is I am going to ask for somebody to give an answer here. But during my postdoc in rehab medicine here at UW, we were developing a measure of caregiver stress. And these were questions that turned out were being interpreted by families, or parents, I should say, in the exact same way. And so we didn't need to have, in these pairs, both of these questions. And so I'm going to ask you all, CARE 11 and CARE 33, which question would you retain? Why?
Sometimes I get a good night's sleep and I still feel exhausted.
That's good. That's a good one, yeah. She said sometimes she gets a good night's sleep and still feels exhausted. Are there thoughts around why? Okay. So, anybody think that the other question should be retained? Yeah? Yeah. So what I'll say is we actually retained 11. And the reason we retained 11 is because deprived, that's a high reading level word. I know, right? So parents were actually more able to understand the first question. But these are the type of considerations that we have to do. And when we run our analysis, we go back to our cognitive interviews and we're like, okay, seemed like parents actually liked this question better, so we'll retain this one. But this is why I think measurement is fun, because it's really kind of a puzzle of putting it all together. What about the next two? $44?
Well, 44 assumes that you have work that you can take time off from.
Yes. Yeah. That's the key, yeah. So we actually retained 43 because of that very reason. And what actually ended up needing to happen is when we were looking at including any questions with work, we didn't have like a unidimensional measure anymore because half of our sample wasn't working because of needing to care give. And so clinically, we were advised that we should keep these questions in the assessment, but that they should be separate and not a part of the summary score. And that's why talking to actual clinicians is important in measurement development too. So then additionally, differential item functioning. And I think this is probably one of the coolest things that we can do with IRT, as essentially it allows us to determine if questions are being understood differently based on the demographics of people answering them. So what we want to see is items having absolutely no diff. So whether you have a high school diploma or a PhD, you understand this and are answering it the same way. Inadvertently, during my doctoral training, we ended up discovering that children with autism have a completely different developmental profile when it comes to social emotional factors. And we know that, but what we were able to actually show was that while kids with autism do develop certain skills later than their peers, there's actually other skills they develop way earlier. And I wish this was more in our clinical practice, because I think this is such an amazing way to tell parents about their child having autism, and that yes, there may be some difficulties, but they're actually probably going to have these other skills way earlier than their peers, and you can really lean into that. And so ideally we like to see no diff, but sometimes when we see it, we end up finding an entire developmental profile by accident that wins an award. So yeah, that was fun. And then finally, I just want to talk about why IRT also allows us to choose the best items. And so when we do a two-parameter, what it looks like is we're able to look at the difficulty of the item in terms of kind of the slope, and then the discrimination. And so difficulty I won't touch on too much, but discrimination is important because this allows us, when we're doing short forms, to choose the best items that are going to be able to discriminate between different people. So when we have a steeper slope, that item is better at discriminating between somebody who has a higher trait level and a lower trait level. So when we're thinking about creating, one or two questionnaires with 1, 2, 3 questions, we want to choose the best questions that we know will get us the best answers with the limited response time for parents. And so that's why we can use discrimination in that way. So lots of just different fun things. Yeah.
I love this kind of stuff. I gotta ask you, did you use responses to create the slopes, or how did you generate the slopes?
Yeah, so it's based on the way that different, so this is from, what is this from? This is from another measure. It's just that, but essentially we do like a whole large scale standardization where you have like over 1,000 people respond, and then you're able to create all of these different graphs using the way that people responded to understand sort of how these items are functioning based on different, characteristics of different groups within your sample. And then this is also my favorite part. So a lot of times we also, have to kind of create what our response options are going to be. And sometimes those kind of just feel willy-nilly, but there's a whole science behind it, or there can be. And it's actually my preference, and other measurement people will say this, but other people have different preferences. I think you should always have an even number, because people are always going to go to the middle. And so if you have 5 response options, you're going to get more people choosing that middle option rather than needing to discriminate themselves between those two. And so when we look at the response curves, what that essentially allows us to see is, are these options being understood separately? Or again, are they conflating so that often and sometimes they're actually meaning the same thing for parents here? And so here what you'll see is we have distinct curves. And so this is what we would want to see. And then I'll show you 2 examples. So here on the first one on the left side, you'll see that 1 and 2, those humps run into each other. This isn't a good item anymore because the response options aren't functioning in a way that are giving us the best answers. If this was a question that was felt by our expert panel and our parents that this just needs to be retained, we would need to go back in and revise it in a new sort of secondary standardization, but usually we would just not retain this item. On the right side, you'll see there are distinct humps, and so this item is functioning in a way that we would want it to, and we know that we can retain it. Okay, so that was a little brief overview of item response theory, and now we're going to put it all together. So, thinking of creating this tool, I wanted to move beyond just creating a tool, because what I saw during my postdoc and doctoral training was tools being created separately than the interventions that were going to use them. And I was like, we gotta approach this differently. So knowing kind of what the vision of this tool is gonna be, and hearing from the community that this need for more developmental promotion support could exist, I started thinking, what if we are able to essentially enhance the capacity and ability of these developmental navigators to not just do the screening and get families connected to resources, but actually be able to provide developmental promotional support. And so what that initially looked like was hosting a series of co-design sessions last year with families that spoke English, Spanish, and Somali. And we had 3 different sessions. So it was, 3 times 8, 24 meetings overall. And no, sorry, that's not right. It's 12. And essentially what we talked about was, where are you getting information for your supports? What does that look like in the clinic? And then what would it look like if you had somebody that could provide more support and then help you track that support over time? And so essentially what that ended up creating was a framework that I am in the process of writing up to be published, but that essentially sort of shows how this tool would be utilized by these community health workers to essentially inform the intervention. And I'll keep going here. So this is out of place. Yes. And then additionally, at the same time, we have been creating new screening screening items that are more culturally relevant to reflect the way that families understand their child's development. And what this has looked like is soliciting photos, which we're still working on, to essentially do a photo elicitation process where we ask families to share doing different activities that are important. And then we take what they share and craft those into new items that then will be tested in cognitive interviewing. These were some of the prompts. But that rather than thinking, asking parents, what didn't you like about this question? It's a more natural way to get at what are parents in 2024 doing with their kids that they value. And then finally, once we have all of these items and we do that large-scale standardization with over 1,000 parents, we can actually create a computer adaptive test. And so if any of you have taken the GRE or anything like that, where based on how you answer one question, you either get a harder or an easier question, and if you're taking the GRE and you start getting easier questions, you're like, crap, that's not good. I've been there. But when we use this from a health, intervention standpoint, this can actually be really meaningful because it reduces the response time for parents while also giving us a real full developmental profile still. And that's what this looks like. So this is called an item map, and right now it's mostly trained professionals that look at this and then interpret it in terms of how they would craft interventions for the family. And part of my KO1 work that I'm doing right now is actually looking at how we can take what is traditionally put out and make it accessible to families in a way that gives them suggestions on activities that they can work on with their children. So kind of going back to this whole, how do we create a measure that actually informs intervention, is that this is the output. And at the top, what you'll see is the domain here is responsibility. So this is from an adaptive measure of adaptive behavior measure that I was a part of. during my doctoral work. And you've got your scaled score and your T-score. And your scaled score is the individual score of the child that then you can watch over time improve. And your T-score is where that child sits in relation to the national standard average. And around 50 is what we want to see. So this kid is kind of right on track for where they would want to be for their age. But what's really cool here is that the mapping shows every single item that exists in this item bank, and the numbers that are red were the questions that were actually asked. So we're able to have a pretty good idea of where this kid sits on all of these different skills without having to ask them all about these different skills. Because when we do that large scale standardization, we're able to figure out what items represent lower trait levels and higher trait levels. And that is then how we can have a measure that consistently can do that for, X amount of families for forever. And so what that then looks like is a practitioner, traditionally an occupational therapist, sitting down with the family and talking about these different skills and saying, you said that your child you don't have, or let's see, number 2 here, adult has most responsibility. Do you think that your child is ready to start taking on more of that responsibility? Here's some suggestions for how you could start transferring that skill more to your child. And this is what this can look like for every single developmental domain in a developmental screening item as well. And so that's how we create a full intervention. Yeah. Yeah, that's like the whole argument that was like in my grant. My issue with our current developmental screening tools is that there's an expectation of access to resources. And so part of doing that photo elicitation is really trying to understand what activities really do require those resources and what is about more just that child developing that skill in relation to their parents or other sort of environment. So as an example, on the ASQ, there's that Cheerio question. Can't stand it. I think Cheerios is behind it. Like there's big Cheerio behind that because I just don't get it. But the reality is that could be asked for anything, right? Like you're asking about grasping, right? And so this is where we want to create questions that don't cause families to feel like if they don't have a specific resource that there's either something, they can't answer the question or there's something wrong, because that also can happen, is that they can start to feel like I'm not giving everything to my family or to my kid, and that can cause kind of a secondary trauma that we don't talk about a lot. But yes, that's why we're actually creating new questions that are more designed to not have that resource need.
So it is being considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And then finally, just to finish up, so I had mentioned this idea of short forms, but essentially once we have this huge pool, my long-term vision, which would probably be like 10 years down the line, would be that clinics would be able to actually create short forms knowing what items are the best that then also meet whatever is culturally appropriate for the clinics they serve. So, talking about playing outside might not be the best question to ask about in certain communities, but that might be all that kids do in other communities. And so really having sort of a toolkit that eventually could create a lot more tailored options. But that is a ways away. First, we have to kind of design this whole initial system. And then just to kind of revisit, these are the project goals, and I hope that overall I have talked about how the design of this new tool can meet all of these goals. And now I look forward to any questions that people have.
Thank you, Kendra. That was amazing. It was so wonderful to hear your work, and so important for all of us in primary care who really feel a lot of the same challenges that you described. It sounds like you get a lot of the ideas for like what are the actual questions asked from this photo elicitation process that you go through. I guess I'm wondering, like, how do you figure out like what you're missing? Like, right? Like, how do you, like, is it just like you come up with you come up with your initial thing and then you test it with like thousands of people and then maybe I don't know, there's something that people aren't understanding, or something that like maybe that photo like isn't what a lot of people do? So I guess how do you figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question, and I think it really speaks to how this is more of an art. And the reality is that we will try and have as many questions as we can in the item bank, but we're going to miss some things. And the beauty of having an item bank is that you can always add new questions and just re-standardize it over time. And so the adaptive measure that I showed, that responsibility domain, that wasn't a part of the initial measure, the PD, when it was first developed. But over time, it became obvious that this was something that was really important in occupational therapy, working with parents and kids, and having a way to assess it was needed. So then there was a whole new domain added. And so, yeah, essentially, when we see this in practice, we might find that there are communities that this still isn't aligning with, and that's where we would seek supplementary grants to essentially craft new questions. And I have a feeling this is going to be important in Indigenous communities, specifically with some of the work and people that I've talked to in Alaska and Hawaii. And so, so we're trying our best, but I think this is something that will always need to be updated, but that's sort of my goal. And I will say that I'm working with the Washington Department of Health to be able to sort of host this when it's done. And ideally, it could be, updated every 10 years. That would probably be the best, because a lot of these questions on the PDCAT, when this was initially created between 2008 and 2014, already don't reflect what kids are doing, like even with tying shoes and using belts. So, yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Firstly, thank you, because I feel like as clinicians, it's rewarding to see like that the tensions and insecurities about our shortcomings in the clinic are being acted on a broader scale. And you see a kid and you're like, damn, I wish I could do more. Like, this sucks, and to feel like
It's that moral injury.
people who know how to do math are on it.
Yeah.
And so that's really, I just appreciate all of this. And also I was wondering, this is probably for way down the line, but the role of self-reporting for adolescents, or when we get over that threshold of kids being able to kind of speak for themselves, or speak in whatever language.
Yeah.
Mode.
So I have a lot of feelings about self-report, because my dissertation was on self-report of youth with intellectual disabilities and having to prove that they could do that, and that we should listen. And so what I'll say is that there's a lot of evidence that kids as young as 6 and 7 can accurately self-report when the questions are presented correctly. And so while this is a measure of 0 to 5, ideally, we would want to continue being able to assess development and acquisition of different skills in a way that not only asks the parent but the child themselves. And so I would love that. The adaptive behavior measure I mentioned actually does go up to age 21, and one of my mentors during my doctoral work, Jessica Kramer, she's in Florida now, has grants to make that a self-report. So, those do exist out there, and I totally agree with you that is definitely the next phase of just believing that kids can say what they feel, and it's meaningful.
Some questions and comments online. Thank you, Kendra. One of the best presentations given with real facts. Question: how do we continue to educate our colleagues and families, especially being in the most diverse city in the country? How much support is truly needed to the families we serve, especially with early childhood? And how much that support from the beginning is needed for those kiddos to thrive, especially with 0 to 5?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just acknowledging that our systems aren't set up for us, and that our families and you all as practitioners shouldn't be internalizing the difficulties that we're experiencing, because none of what was designed is designed in a way that creates the best outcomes that they can. And so I think that's probably the first thing when we're talking to families and our colleagues. And then the second is that because they haven't been designed as well as they can, we have this incredible opportunity to create something new. And I recognize that it can be hard to stay optimistic in a system that is continually being eaten by capitalism. I have lots of feelings about that. Liz is right there. She knows. Yeah. But that the more that we really reflect on creating those authentic relationships through our understanding of our own positionality and the positionality of our families, the more that we can kind of counter those feelings that are forever sort of like crushing down on, the idea of needing to be as efficient as possible, and, the idea of, quantity over quality, where all of us would prefer quality over quantity. So yeah, sorry I don't have more of like a, three-step solution, but yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for a fascinating talk. I was wondering if you could go back to something you mentioned at the very beginning of
Yeah.
your talk about the difference in time for well-child visits
Oh, yeah.
for families speaking Spanish versus families speaking English. Did that difference persist if there was an interpreter present?
Yes, but what I'll say is our sample of the interpreter being present is really, really small. So I don't want to say that that is like a definite. But what we did hear in those visits that were, when we audio recorded it, they were coded by native Spanish speakers. And what they were hearing was that the interpretations were not always complete. They were being like truncated. And so everything the parent was asking or saying was not necessarily being communicated fully to the clinician. And so that still led to these shorter visits, unfortunately.
Kendra, amazing work as usual. It was so great to hear it all come together. I have a question. We've talked about this before about outcomes. And so from the work that you've done, what are the outcomes that matter to these communities? What should we be measuring to know that the strategies that we're using, that you're testing, are successful? Are there a suite of outcomes, or is there one? We've talked about relational health before.
Yeah. What I'll say is that the families, being able to have multiple sessions with them was really beautiful because they started to really open up. And the two things that were really important to them were learning how to do things differently than their parents had done with them, and knowing that they were doing that. And so in terms of outcomes, what I'll say is I think that is relational health. And so many of these parents basically said, I know my parents did the best that they could, and I know they did a lot of things wrong, and I don't want to do those same things. So I want to know how to do it better. And so that's one of the things that they're asking for. And then the other thing that the parents really, really said was that I just want to know that my doctor or my care team cares what's going on in my life. They can ask, all of this stuff, but I also want them to care that, my kid is starting kindergarten on Monday, or we're going on vacation, or, that kind of stuff. And so I think those are the things. And what I'm really hearing is there's just this really strong desire right now for connection and relationships that aren't present where they really could be. So I think that's sort of what's mattering now in terms of outcomes. It's not, did they get all their vaccines, which, I get for pay, but for parents, it's connection and community.
Thank you so much. I will end with this comment from Dr. Marshall from online, which I think all of us will agree with. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation and for sharing your personal stories. I also so appreciate you pointing out the art as well as the science involved in this work. Thanks so much for being here, all of you, and especially you, Dr. Lillianquist, and for all of your hard work and future work. Thanks so much, everybody.